Happy Friday, and welcome to our Museums at Noon event. My name is Deirdre Hennebury, and I'm the Associate Director of the Museum Studies program here at the University of Michigan. And before introducing our speaker today, I'd like to mention a couple of additional programs of interest that are on our Museum Studies calendar for November. So on Friday, November 12th at noon, Zach Koppen will be presenting on his work at Johannesburg's Constitution Hill. And on Tuesday, November 16th at 4:30 p.m., we are hosting a panel discussion on accessibility in museums, where we will virtually welcome museum professionals and researchers from the Smithsonian, the Henry Ford, and Vanderbilt University to share their work on developing meaningful and inclusive museum experiences. For the full description of both of those events and other future events, and of course the Zoom registration details, please look to our Museum Studies webpage. And now to our featured event. Zoe Ortiz, she earned her Bachelor of Arts in Classics from the University of Virginia in 2011. After which she spent 2 years teaching Latin in Northern Virginia before moving on to complete a post-baccalaureate in classical archaeology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Zoe is a member of the Museum Studies program, the cohort of 2016, and is currently a doctoral candidate in the interdepartmental program in classical art and archaeology at the University of Michigan. Her field work covers quite a bit of terrain. She's excavated at James Madison's Montpellier, in Azoria, Crete, Gabii, Italy, and has conducted pottery research on the island of Kea in Greece. In addition, Zoe has had the opportunity to conduct research as an intern at the Louvre Museum in Paris, France, as well as at the Vatican Secret Archives in Rome, Italy. Her current research focuses on imperial Roman sculpture, especially from the city of Gabii. She enjoys exploring questions concerning social identity, urban landscape formation, and the presence of the imperial cult in middle range cities. As you join me in welcoming Zoe Ortiz, I encourage you to add questions to the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end of her presentation. So welcome, Zoe.
Hi, okay, thank you so much for that introduction. As Deirdre said, my name is Zoe, and I'm in my 7th year here at Michigan, and I am here to talk about my practicum that I did for the Museum Studies program, which I conducted at the Louvre. Luckily, this work also centered around my dissertation research. So to begin, I will give a brief overview about what my dissertation is and about the questions that I'm currently trying to answer, as well as the reflections I had while I was actually at the Louvre. Here's a little warning for you at the front. I'm not going to provide a lot of answers, but I will have a lot of questions. So maybe it'll give us a lot to talk about at the end. But before I move on, I would like to express my very deep thanks at the onset to the Museum Studies program who made this experience possible, and the Gabii project, Nick Terranato, the director, and my advisor, who introduced and supported this research. And of course, I would like to thank the Musée du Louvre and all the people that I worked with there for just their willingness to help me as well as collaborate with me. So to start, as pretty much all archaeologists tend to do, I would like to give a quick history of the city that is at the focus of this research, and that city is called Gabii. Gabii, it's an ancient Roman city. It's only about 20 kilometers east of Rome, and it's in the Latium area of Italy, which is basically the center. It has its origins in the early Iron Age, and it actually grew on pace with Rome all the way up until like the mid-Republican period. But then at one point, Rome kind of grew and really expanded, and as Rome grew larger, Gabii started to grow much, much smaller. and both its size and its population were severely decreased. So this is a close-up of where Gabii is located. As you can see, it's on the southern edge of a crater. So it's interesting, it's a volcanic crater that was then eventually turned into a lake, and we think in ancient times, but then now it's turned into farmland. And Gabii is situated right here on the southeastern kind of bottom portion of it. So what you see here is actually a 10-year period of progress that was conducted at Gabii by the Michigan Gabii project. So this project has been, is centered at the very center of the city. This is where it was most populated in the mid-Republican period. And so that's why Michigan, the Gabii project, Nick Terrato, decided to dig here, because this is where all of that activity was going on in the Republican period. And this is where I normally dig. But I have a stronger interest in a different part of the city. So what we have here is a map, and it was drawn in 1856, and it shows 3 different phases of the city. You can see on the right, it says Prima Città di Gabii, and then in the center, it says Seconda Città, and then on the left-hand side, which is towards the west, it says Terza Città di Gabii. What this map shows us is that even in the 1800s, they had an idea that there are several phases to this city. And what we could do is compare that with the information that we got on a modern day magnetometry survey that the Gabii project did, which actually confirms this suspicion, right? This hypothesis that started in the 1800s, that Gabii contracted. It moved from the east, where the original mid-Republican city center was, to the west. And on top of all of that, we have the archaeological and the archival evidence of decline. It's only bolstered by the ancient authors during that time and their description of Gabii. So to begin, we have Cicero, who says that unless indeed you are at a place like Gabii, where you could hardly find a single citizen to bear a part in the Latin holidays. Or we have Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who says that the city was Gabii. Today, not all parts of it are still inhabited, but only those that lie next to the highway and are given up to inns. But at that time, it was as large and populous as any city. And then my personal favorite from Propertius, which says, "And Alba stood mighty, born of the omen of a white sow. And Gabii, which now is nothing, was then a great multitude." So we put all of these things together, right? The ancient sources, archival maps, and the actual archaeological data. It all says that Gabii in the imperial period is basically nothing, right? Well, the focus of my research actually suggests something quite different. So the presentation and my dissertation, in fact, is to present the anomaly of Gabii during this period. We know that we have all this evidence saying that it contracted, but at this exact time of contraction, of population decrease, is when we find a absolutely massive collection of very nice, finely sculpted, full-scale sculptures that presumably were on display at Gabii during this time. Now, this is a strong disconnect, right? A lot of people had a different way of thinking in the past, where if there were sculptures, that meant that it was wealthy, that it was thriving. Now, we know that Gabii wasn't exactly thriving, but we still have to contend with the existence of these sculptures. And that's what I hope to do with my dissertation. But first, it all starts with this man. His name is Gavin Hamilton, and he was the one who discovered Gabii. He excavated at Gabii first. So he was a painter in his own right, but he made the biggest name for himself by excavating in the Roman countryside and finding ancient artifacts that he would later sell. He supposedly did 40 different excavations. To this end, he first excavated at Gabii in 1776, but he found very little in that first campaign. It was when he tried again in 1792 that he found what can be easily said one of the largest caches of sculptures found on the peninsula. In this letter, we could certainly sense his excitement when he says, "I cannot help putting pen to paper and to give you some account of my proceedings at the Cava of Gabii." Cava is the 18th century term for excavation. "The exact spot of which is now decided by the interesting inscriptions I found in that place, to the great joy of all antiquarians." This was a very big deal, basically, when he brought all these sculptures to light. And a lot of the antiquarians were, in fact, very excited. The full extent of what he found is difficult to determine, but in the same letter, he says, "I have found fragments of at least 200 statues, but so mutilated that I have only been able to save 22 statues that are good and worthy restoring, besides other curious things of different kinds in small statue heads, etc." So he wrote this basically right when he began the excavation. Anyone who's excavated at Gabii with me knows that the idea of finding 200 pieces of marble, let alone 200 statues just sounds unbelievable. And it's kind of a difficult number to believe, but in the end, we do have a large collection of sculptures that come from this dig. In fact, he says 22 statues, but we have close to 40 that we think actually did come from Gabii. So where did he dig? So this is Gabii. This is the western part of the crater. What we see here in this map, this is a topographical map that we created, and then this is just a satellite image. This is the Temple of Juno. It is in the ruins of which have always been visible, and so that's probably what brought Hamilton to the site to dig. But it was built in the mid-Republican period, and we have evidence that it was in use all the way into the imperial period. So it is possible that it brought people to Gabii they come for the temple, but maybe they stay for something else. It's kind of part of an idea that I have in my head at the moment, but that's another line of thought. But what the area I'm most interested in is this one you see right here in the bottom right. This is an area that was excavated by the Soprintendenza di Roma in the early 1990s. They say that it is the area that Hamilton excavated. The reason why I say they say is because the records of this excavation have not been released, and they aren't public currently. We do hope that that's going to change soon, and it does seem like this area is going to be able to be opened up for research soon, and I'm very much looking forward to that so that we could just confirm that that is in fact the area that Hamilton excavated. But according to Hamilton's records, this is what he found. On the left is a reconstruction of what he calls a public space, and then later on it started to be called Hamilton's Forum. Whether or not it was a real forum that's kind of a semantic, struggle of what is a forum. Either way, it is very likely he did find a very open public space like this, and there is a lot more to be said about this area. But unfortunately, there's not enough space in this talk to do so. So what exactly did he find? So he found an impressive range of sculpture. So it starts with certain imperial sculptures. So this is a bust of Septimius Severus, who was an emperor, and he is just one of about a dozen representations of different emperors, ranging from the 1st to the 3rd century BC, or sorry, not BC, AD. But we also have things like this, which is a tripod basin, which is more of like is indicative of a domestic space. So it's unclear where exactly that where if that was part of the public space or not. It might have been, but it's more domestic. We also have some things that are hard to understand why they are in the collection. So this is actually a bronze vase in the shape of a young man's head. And the thing is that this predates everything else by like 500 years. So it is a little interesting that it's in the collection because we don't know why it's there, and that maybe it was an heirloom, or maybe Hamilton found it somewhere else and it just got lumped into the Gabii collection. It definitely deserves more research. Another type of statue that we find is one like this, where it is probably meant to honor a citizen of Gabii. So this one is I'm particularly happy about because I just discovered it, sort of. This is one of the ones that was not part of the Louvre collection, and so I was able to track it down to a museum here in Rome, where I am currently. And it was just exciting to see it in person and like have it documented more securely where it is and where it came from. Okay, so what happened after they found these sculptures? Well, Visconti, he was another antiquarian. He was a curator of the collection, and they wanted to bring the whole collection back to the Borghese estate because the initial excavation was on the Borghese estate, and or sorry, not on the Borghese estate, but on Borghese property. And so a lot of the sculptures were owned by the Borghese. And so it was there that they were transported, and it was there that they were restored. So Visconti is a very interesting character who was interested in pretty sculptures like many other 18th century people were, but he also was taking the first steps towards the scientism of looking at ancient sculptures. And so he published this catalog, the Monumenti Gabii della Villa Tinciana, which is a full catalog of all the sculptures and his own analysis. It's a very useful resource for researchers like me because his drawings show us what kind of restorations he probably carried out. And also it gives more evidence that these are the pieces that were discovered at Gabii. So this is what brought me to the Louvre. I needed to take a closer look at the statues. So with the help of the conservators and the curators, I was able to determine much more accurately what parts of the sculptures were present at Gabii and which were not. In order for me to truly understand the socio-cultural environment of Gabii in the 1st and 2nd century, it was necessary for me to know what sculptures were actually there, what did they look like. So for example, these two sculptures, which are in the Louvre, are labeled as Caligula and Sabina, but neither of these statues are those two people. So this one has the head of Caligula, but the body of probably Vespasian or one of his sons. And this is labeled as Sabina, who is the wife of Hadrian, and the head and the cornucopia are not original to the statue. So this was like the nature of my work, is kind of trying to untangle these threads of time. For example, the head doesn't belong to the statue, but according to some records of Visconti and Hamilton, the head did come from the Gabii excavation. So does it belong to another body? Did they just choose the wrong body to put it onto? These are the kind of questions that I'm trying to ask and that I was, considering while I was at the Louvre. The 3 most important statues I would say that were discovered by Hamilton are these 3. As you can see, they all have a very similar pose. The pose is called the heroic half-nude pose. And for those of you who know your Roman history, this is Claudius, Emperor Claudius Germanicus, who is his nephew. I don't know, he's related somehow. And then Nero. So all 3 of these are part of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and the similarity in how they were created, and even if you see them in person, the marble is very similar, tells you that they were probably created together. So what this does is actually gives us this really wonderful anchor at Gabii that we know at around what time this was made, because these are Julian Claudian, representations. And also that there's a sense of purposefulness, right? That these aren't just random statues that were pulled from one place or another, but somebody probably commissioned these statues, commissioned this group together, and for it to be at Gabii. So it's a really good indicator when I try to understand the goals of the citizens of Gabii. Another great piece of evidence is this very large inscription that Hamilton found. It details a temple that was erected in honor of the house, or in the memory of the house of Domitia Augusta. And it says here that it was a temple made and adorned with statues and other things. And later on in the inscription, it gives the date of 140 AD. So this is kind of the mother lode for an archaeologist, because it is, once again, another anchor that gives us a time and a place. The 140 AD, and it says Gabii, the location is Gabii, and it says that there are statues that go along with this temple. So at the very least, we know that that this one area existed, and that we have a firm context, a possible context for these sculptures. Domitia is a whole other story. I wish I could really get into it because it's really quite fascinating, but quickly, Domitia was the wife of the former Emperor Domitian. And the thing is that Domitian was assassinated, and he received a damnatio memoriae, which means, if you don't know what that means, it's that his whole memory is erased. So from public documents and statues, everything. So usually the wife of the emperor or the person getting that doesn't fare very well. So the fact that we have Domitia, who is an undeified woman. So as far as I know, there are no other temples in all of Italy that are to an undeified woman. So she is an undeified woman who was married to a disgraced emperor who was assassinated. And the real kicker for me is that this was all 40 years after he was assassinated. She was getting close to 90 years old at this time. And so why does she have a temple to her? It's really quite an interesting subject matter, but obviously I don't have enough time to really go into it. It also gives me the opportunity to think more about how Domitian looks a lot like a young Randy Quaid, but again, that's a different talk. So this photo here is, this should be playing. This photo here shows me, or shows the different points of access I was allowed to have when I was at the Louvre. So the Louvre was closed on Tuesdays, and these were the days I was able to go in and research the sculptures so I could look at them very closely. And on the left, you can see that this is actually a storeroom at the Louvre, and they gave me access to go in there as well, so I could look even closer. And it was just very kind of the people at the Louvre to be so open and willing to collaborate with me and to help me with my research. And this is a very shameless Snapchat video that I took showing what it's like to walk in the halls with nobody there. So this piece is one of my favorites, and I'm currently writing an article about it. It also is another thing that I can't talk too much about because there's so much to say, but it is one of the most compelling pieces because we're not 100% sure what it was for or what it represents. There's very few comparanda for it, but what you see are 12 busts of the Olympian gods surrounding and then a recess in the middle that's very, very shallow. And along the edge of the disc is a low relief frieze of the zodiac symbols, which are alternated with more symbols of the same gods that you see on top. It truly is almost like nothing else. And what's interesting is Hamilton doesn't mention it in his letters, but Visconti in his catalog dedicates 20 pages to this one artifact, whereas all of the other sculptures get no more than 1 or 2 pages. So he was truly really quite fascinated as well. And hopefully I can break some of its mysteries in my article, but that is also another talk. So speaking more generally about my experience at the Louvre, I inevitably began to consider how the Louvre is a polyvalent institution in its own right. So this is the basement of the museum, and it's dedicated to the archaeological remains of the first iterations of the museum, which began its existence actually as a defensive castle in the 12th century CE. After the city developed further, though, as we all know, where the Louvre is no longer the center of the city. So they turned it from that defensive outpost into a area for the French monarchy to live, a palace. But then after that, the Louvre after that, Louis XIV moved the palace and the royal residence to Versailles. And so what they did was they turned this space into the official place for exhibiting royal artwork. And so this is the first time that artwork started to be shown in the space. And then after that, during the Napoleon's period, it becomes more of a museum institution like we know. So when I was there, right, I was thinking quite a lot, and these are a lot of the questions that I have that I don't really have the answers to. But I thought a lot about how a museum like the Louvre is an exhibition all by itself, right? And that it has its own history, and that we could see these different levels of existence. So what you see at the bottom of the screen is actually what it looked like when it was the defensive castle. So I think that we need to consider what it means to put art within art, right? Or put history within history, and how that changes our perception of what we're seeing. How much does it alter our view and our understanding of the pieces that are in the building? So that was one thought that I had. And then I also considered a lot about ownership. So clearly there is a benefit to visitors and researchers to have one singular institution, to have a huge collection of objects from cultures all over the world that you might not be able to see otherwise. But on the other hand, the story of these objects are being told by one institution, in this case, the Louvre, and not by their respective places of origin. So what then does it mean to actually tell an object's story? And does the right to tell the story belong to the people who created it, to the people who own it, or is the story embedded in the object itself? So these are the kinds of questions that led me to consider more deeply the concept of object biography, which is truly at the heart of my own research. The sculptures, I'm looking at the sculptures diachronically from their beginning at Gabii all the way to their existence now at the Louvre. And so we kind of have to ask these questions of how to tell the story of an object, and that you can't necessarily be fully authoritative with such, ownership questions. Another very important example is the role of the Louvre in World War II. So as some of you might know, in 1940, Hitler and his armed forces invaded France and took over the capital city of Paris. So having an eye for all of the artwork at the Louvre, he went in expecting to be able to take all of it. But thankfully, the staff of the Louvre was able to move out almost all of the artwork. But that didn't stop Hitler from using the space to store and display all the artwork that he stole, which I'm sure we all know is quite a lot. So After World War II and the defeat of Hitler, there was some attempt to return this artwork, a lot to Jewish families who originally owned it, but a lot did not get returned. And so when I was there, actually about 3 days after I got there, this news broke that 3 paintings that the Louvre, loaned to the Shoah organization, they told the Louvre that they weren't giving it back, and that they believe that it should belong to them because they had original Jewish owners. And so this really, brings up some interesting, very difficult questions. So like such issues, and they're very similar to the marbles of the Parthenon marbles. Some of you guys might know about that up in the British Museum. Questioning who has the right to hold on to something. So for example, in this case, if hypothetically the Louvre was in possession of work from a Jewish person who died during World War II and none of their relations are known to have survived, does that mean the Louvre owns the piece, even though it was originally stolen? And if someone does have a claim, where exactly does the burden of proof lie? Unfortunately, a lot of these court cases don't get very far, and the restitution process is very, very, very difficult. And I think it's because these questions are very difficult to answer. Another thing that I thought a lot about when I was at the museum was how it was such a point of connection. So it was really an awe-inspiring experience, and I sometimes had to pinch myself to remember that this was all real. But there was a couple times where I had the opportunity to see the Mona Lisa all by myself, and it was such a moment that it struck me that in that moment, I was standing in a place where thousands and thousands, if not millions of people stood for one reason. And to be able to stand there, a place where so many people have literally, paid, did a pilgrimage to, I felt connected to those people through time. Now, I don't know much, despite the fact that I'm an art historian, I can't claim too much knowledge of art past the 6th century AD, everything that's modern. But so some of the intricacies of the Mona Lisa were unfortunately lost on me. But this moment of being able to connect with all of those people, dead or alive, I stood there and we all had a shared purpose. And there are very few places outside of museums that you could really do this. This is a place where we share experiences. Museums hold a truly unique position in our society. They are these epicenters of connection. It was this fact that brought me to museum studies in the first place, to understand an institution that's at the crossroads between history and culture and knowledge, education, politics, and even the creation of the future and our knowledge that will happen in the future. So it's this one institution, therefore, that must be so many different things to different people at different times, which is an incredibly difficult endeavor, but also an opportunity. Because it's one of those few places that it invites people from all backgrounds, ages, education, and abilities into one space. So when I walk these halls, these empty halls, I realized that their meaning became different when they were empty. And that it was almost as if some of their meaning had been lost. And so it reminded me that the reason that we build these institutions are for all the people who visit. And those people are meant to span the whole spectrum of society, from the poor to the rich, to the young to the old. And it's a difficult task, but I think that's one of the most amazing things about museums. And the Louvre definitely showed me that. So this is the very last image that I'm going to show you, and the last statue. So this is the statue of Diana of Gabii. It is the only one of the statues that has a moniker like that, of Gabii. And it is easily the most famous statue of the Gabii collection. So on my first day in Paris, there were two things that told me that I had arrived at the Louvre on the metro. The first was a huge sign that said the Louvre, conveniently. But the second thing was a plaster cast of Diana of Gabii, my Diana of Gabii. And it really kind of made me stop and really think about how this is a first century statue reproduction standing seamlessly in a 21st century metro station. And what exactly does that say about the past and how we can use something like this basically as a signpost? People look at this and know that that's a place to go to learn, or there's culture. How many millions of people have looked at that one image and it gave them direction in life, or not in life, but in that moment. So I realized that from this, that the past is present and that we're not immune to history. And whatever we create today, whatever we do today will move into the future as well. And so we need to, really think carefully and hard about museums and how they are the societal connection of, they're the societal intersection, of both time and culture. And that's where we get to meet together. Thank you. And here's just a small screen for all the people I want to thank. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Zoe. I want to encourage all of our attendees to share questions in the Q&A. And I have a question. So right now you're still working on the end of your dissertation and you're in Rome. And how did your time at the Louvre sort of inform some of the work you're now doing with the Vatican archives? Do you see, what are some of the connections there for you?
Yeah, actually the connections are pretty immediate, because the archive here at the Vatican is the Borghese Archives. And so I'm actually reading the records that the sculptors themselves wrote. And so I can see that there's still a disconnect, which is not surprising. It's very difficult sometimes to understand who does what in the past, but I'm able to piece together a little bit more clearly which sculptor worked on which which sculptor worked on which sculpture. And sometimes we even have new information pop up. So there, because of going through the archives, we now know that there was an altar to Venus that was discovered at Gabii, and it was not reported by any of the main sources, but that it was reported by somebody who only spent like a day at Gabii. So it's kind of finding these little treasures. To be honest, I came here and I didn't know what I expected. I was thinking, it's possible I don't find anything useful, but so far we actually have been finding quite a lot to fill out our information about who worked on the sculptures and why, and also how much they paid to do it.
Wonderful. I'm also wondering, going back to your Louvre internship experience and your Tuesdays, your free Tuesdays, where you were able to explore these wonderful storerooms. Can you say something else about other responsibilities you may have had? I know students in internship traditionally are also given sort of museum practice tasks. How did your research and then the more practical aspects of your internship kind of align?
Yeah, so a lot of my work at the Louvre was actually going through all of the archives that they have and the dossiers associated with each sculpture. I was incredibly lucky. Like, the curator of the Roman sculpture was actually moving on to a different position, and the person taking his position wasn't coming for another 3 months. So I was there at this exact moment when his office was empty. So I actually got to sit and work in the Roman curator's office, and I was just someone's going to find out about this and kick me out. And so that was pretty amazing. So I actually spent most of my time in there looking at the dossiers and going through the records that the Louvre had and trying to match them to what other information was known. The big thing that I did, though, that I worked with the curator and the conservator there, was we actually developed a museum exhibition of the sculptures. We actually started the plans of figuring out a way to make an exhibition that could travel from Paris to Rome to the United States. We were even thinking Ann Arbor. And my advisor, Elaine Dazda, she even came and collaborated with us and tried to figure out the best way to make this work. And like everything else in the world, it got interrupted by COVID. So that is a to be determined thing. But it was wonderful to try and create an exhibition with these professionals. And I definitely used a lot of the experience I got from MSP for that.
Thank you. It does look, we have a question in the Q&A, and Zoe, I don't know if you can see that, or would you like me to read it?
Yeah, if you want to read it.
Okay. We have the question. I found some aspects of access to culture, objects, places in Rome was not always easy or welcome. Can you describe the obstacles to getting access, if you experienced any?
Yeah. If anyone who's ever worked in Italy might know, sometimes it does depend on finding the right day, finding the Italian person on the right day to get the right kind of access. So on my first day at the Vatican, to be honest, it was very stressful. And I had to talk to like 20 different people in Italian, and they didn't know why I was there. And it was very confusing because they have scholars come from all over the world specifically for this. So you'd think that they were used to these kind of visits, but it was actually quite tricky. So sorry, but the thing is that once you got in, it was easy and they wanted to help you. So I think that there is a bit of a barrier that they put out front. But then I think once you kind of get to know them better, they are much more willing to help. Actually, so I'm here for Fulbright, and my Fulbright advisor is actually the director of the Baths of Caracalla. And so I've been working with her as well. And it is very much the same thing. At first they're like, we don't know what to do. But now that I've gotten to know them, become friends with them, the opportunities are kind of expanding on what ways I could collaborate with them. Kirsten, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, thank you, Zoe. This was a wonderful presentation. I love the expanse of it. That you took us from Gabii to Paris, and now you also talked about your experience in Rome. It's wonderful that we can talk to you across time and space here through Zoom. And I especially was intrigued by the way you reflected on the empty space and the space with visitors, and how you were very attuned to having access to the Louvre on the museum's day off. And so you were talking about that connection through space and time with the other visitors, but then of course in your own work, that's what archaeology and what the work of archaeologists is all about. And along the way, you also shared very beautiful reflections about the museum as an institution and the layers of time and practice and function that's inscribed in, especially in an institution like the Louvre. But what I was wondering, so my question is really about how you're thinking about this work of writing biographies of objects have changed over time, from the beginning of your dissertation where you're now very close to finishing. And I can intuition that these experiences at the Louvre or now in Rome and the actual dig in Gabii have all influenced your thinking. But maybe sort of, what has been, there are still a lot of open questions, but what have you gained over that time span of your work?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I would say that I truly learned that no one person can truly be an authority voice of one object. That I do believe that we can know true things about an object, but that never takes away the perception of people from the past, the present, and the future. And so I really have tried to approach my work not as this is the authoritative text of all the Gabii sculptures, this is what is known and will always be known. Instead, I see myself, like I said in my presentation, like we're not immune to history. What's going to happen in 20, 30, 100 years where they're going to look back at our own methods and see that, oh, well, we did something quite wrong, as we do now to those like the antiquarians in my project. So I think I'm trying to be much more respectful of that and respectful of the objects. And, the questions I was asking about who tells the object's story, I think that inevitably we have to listen to all the voices. And I think that's really what I'm trying to do. So, and that includes my own perception. And so I do still have, hypotheses, but I think I'm more, instead of, I remember when I was a Latin teacher, they said, you're not the sage on the stage. You're not just standing there telling everybody what's true or not. Instead, you're more of a participant. And I really truly hope that my research is more about bringing to light that this is a group of sculptures that could teach us quite a lot. And I kind of hope that someone down the line will be like, hey, we even know more now, or here's a hypothesis that works even better. I hope that's the case. That's why I'm doing this. And so, yeah, I when I was standing in the Louvre alone, it was very much a moment where one moment in time, and you're surrounded by time at the Louvre, right? Time and meaning. And I was just like one single moment I was there. And so I try to respect that, I suppose, in my writing.
We have a couple of questions that have come in. And the first has to do with these immersive experiences that you've had, the value of being in person versus remote. If you have any thoughts on that during this time of Zooming.
Oh my gosh, yes. Oh man, that's kind of a tough, it seems like a simple question, but it's kind of tough because, so many people are here and I'm able to, communicate with so many people right now. So how can I say that that's a bad thing? I would not be able to have this conversation in Rome. You guys are getting ready for lunch. I'm getting ready for dinner. It's kind of amazing to think of it that way. But the truth is, like, nothing really truly replaces it. But I do think that the move of technology in the museums is the way to go because as I hope to have shown, and Kirsten even mentioned it, is that at a museum is layers of time, and so therefore it's layers of information. And so I think that when we're able to bring these objects to another space that is so much more accessible, it's better than nothing. I think is the best way to think about it. It truly, like something that I probably will never, I don't know, go to China, but if there is a China 3D, exhibition that I could look at online, I will learn so much more than I would otherwise. And so it kind of helps answer that question of who owns the past, if we could find ways to truly share it online. But with that being said, I'm an archaeologist for a reason. I wanted to get in the dirt and I wanted to touch, these objects that existed thousands of years ago that were manipulated by men thousands of years ago. And it can't be beat, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do all the other things, I suppose.
Yeah, a thoughtful response. We have two more questions. I think we have time for these. So the first is from Gala. And the question is, I thought your comments on the museum spaces as sites of shared experiences of people of different backgrounds was very interesting. Do you think these sites are static, i.e. the experience is always similar as the permanent exhibition is the same? Or does it change over time despite the museum's intention and the exhibits? And then noted in parentheses, I'm thinking a lot about the French propensity for maintaining tradition or, quote, the old way.
Yeah, I really love this question because it was definitely something I thought a lot about when I was at the Louvre. There is one, it's the big hallway that you take to get to the Mona Lisa, and if I remember correctly, it's mostly 18th century painting. Like there's more Da Vinci there, and in the middle, interspersed down the hallway are these little niches, and in the niches are some of the Gabii sculptures, and they don't belong there. The only reason they belong, quote unquote, belong there is because there's a niche there. And the French do have that propensity you talked about, that needs to be filled with sculpture because that was the initial design of that space. And so I thought that was so interesting that they kind of kept on to that tradition, even though I wondered, what were they thinking when they did it? Were they trying to express something in particular, or was it truly just a tradition holding on? So I think that each space is different, but you cannot stop the change of perception. I don't think anything like that could ever be static. I mean, you could talk about this on a macro level where just society is different, different cultures, different races. You cannot change that perspective. Is a person comes in with that perspective. But even on a personal note, I remember having a really impactful experience looking at this one painting because it reminded me of a moment in my past. And I was like, nobody else has that exact feeling based on that painting. And so I think that museums need to leave room for that. And I think the really good ones do. And it's actually kind of exciting, right? I think that's why I love museums, is it is this point of connection, but it's a connection. You get to learn what other people see and come to understand it. Yeah.
Thank you, Zoe. These are such generous responses. I appreciate that so much. So we've got two questions here. The first is, are the excavations at Gabii ongoing? And then the second has to do with the ethics of excavations. And this, so things that have been safe for millennia underground are brought out into the light and accommodations made to keep them supposedly safe again. But our world above ground is still subject to so much upheaval. We could conceivably lose them again. Do you have any perspective on this?
Yeah, so to answer the first question, the Gabii excavations are starting up again for the first time. It didn't happen this past summer or the summer before that because of COVID. So yeah, and I believe actually if you're interested in it as a student, there are applications now for the field school. As to the second question, I think any archaeologist would tell you that one of the very first things they learn, literally archaeology 101, is archaeology is destruction. And so it's something we take very, very seriously. We are stewards of the past. And just because we might not be interested in something doesn't mean other people won't be. And so that's why we take care of all the things that we find, almost all those things. Tile is a whole nother thing, but anyway, so we have to think about that destruction, but it is a cost benefit analysis. If we keep it in the ground, that's the same thing as keeping our heads in the ground, right? There's so much that archaeology has brought to light that has taught us that we would, like, literally whole civilizations we would not know have existed if it wasn't for archaeology. And so we have to keep that in mind. And on top of that, there are a lot of excavations going on that purposely don't go as far as they could. So for example, Pompeii, actually a huge portion of Pompeii is not excavated, even though it would be so fun to do so. And that's mostly because, one, we have too much information anyway that we still need to process. And two, what if we have some amazing technology in the future where when we pull this stuff out of the ground, it doesn't get ruined. Because that does happen. You pick something up and it all of a sudden it just crumbles in your hand. So it is something seriously to consider, and it's in the end, it's all about respect. That these people lived, they were us, just a different time, they were us. And so how would we want people to discover our society today? How would we want people to respect that and learn about it? And so that's how I approach archaeology and excavation. It's not just willy-nilly fun digging up dirt and finding cool things. It's about respecting the cultures that came before us and learning from them.
Thank you, Zoe. I think that's probably a wonderful note to maybe close our Museum at Noon event today. But I want to thank you so much for joining us from Rome. What a special opportunity this is to hear about not just your internship at the Louvre, but your dissertation and all of these fantastic explorations that you're having doing this careful and thoughtful work. So thank you so much.
No, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Zoe. Have a good time in Rome. This was fantastic.
I'll eat all the gelato.
Yes, and thank you all for joining us today.